Well, thank you everybody for the kind invitation and for joining us today. So I wanted to start this discussion with a poem that I wrote a couple of weeks ago, pretty much summarizing the talk. So you can listen to the poem the first 5 minutes, and then you'll get the full content. And then I'll do the more slide by slide discussion of it. So this poem I call it "Longing for Genuine Global Solidarity." So here we go. You know that Green New Deal by Ed Markey and AOC? It needs to be a global GND. Just read the document from the IPCC. It's gloomy as hell, but that's the painful reality. Our plan must be global, with reparations for the tragedy of ecological damage and colonial atrocity. Millions of people want to live freely, with justice for all, peace and prosperity. They want dignity and hope, not your charity. Clean water, clean air, clean soil, that's not a fantasy. No more hunger and bread riots. We'll have food sovereignty. No more darkness nor smog. We'll have clean energy sovereignty. We'll use the sun, the wind, the tides, and even some volcanic energy. We'll end the pain. We'll end the suffering. We'll build a truly circular economy. We'll change the metric to guide every public policy. We'll use GPI, laser focused on quality of life, not some useless GDP. It won't be easy, cheap, or enemy free. The naysayers will scream, the deficit, the debt, oh my God, it's inflationary. Little do they know we have plenty of productive capacity. We'll build even more with our industrial strategy. We'll go after price setters, cartels, and every monopoly. We'll set up Pecora-style hearings in every congressional committee. We'll fight corruption and greed and end the oligarchy. We'll have a brand new Congress in Washington, D.C., 535 lawmakers, and a true participatory democracy, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, like it was supposed to be. We'll tax polluters, speculators, and the oligarchs. You see, not because we need their money or their permission to have an equitable society, but because we need to decarbonize the system and fight inequality. It's the only way forward. I can't compromise and settle for insanity. Don't try to distract my people with your conspiracy theories, QAnon, Rothschilds, gold bugs, and a new kind of cryptocurrency. Let's stick to the facts, history, logic, and a simple accounting identity. It's all brought into sharp focus under the lens of modern monetary theory. It's a little silly, I know, but I like it. I made this poem rhyme with MMT. It's a paradigm shift. It's undeniable, don't you agree? It changes the narrative and it destroys the foundations of austerity. A whole new world is possible without artificial scarcity. We'll fight unemployment, poverty with the job guarantee, with decent wages, full benefits, and every need covered if necessary. We'll make those jobs green, community driven, and focus on the care economy. We'll look after the planet, the children, and the elderly. Every living thing, every drop of water, every inch of soil is our responsibility. Every source of life is so precious, a gift in our custody, not some kind of private property. I'm taking this global climate action plan very seriously because I don't want to end up a climate refugee. Call your reps and tell them about Ayanna Pressley. She wrote the job guarantee resolution to complete the civil rights legacy. Urge them to endorse it promptly. Be sure to warn them. Ignore us and you will see. Your term in office will expire in January 2023. Hit the streets and chant with me. By the ballot or by decree, we demand a job guarantee. Humanity is longing for a genuine global solidarity. So join me in this struggle. It's my final plea. I'll die trying if I have to, for this better future is within reach and it's yearning to be set free. Thank you. So that is the poem. And I don't know if there's a chat box here. I can drop a link to it.
Yeah, you already got incredible and agreed. So those are two nice
Wonderful.
and
Thank you.
claps are emerging.
Um, I can't see the chat here for some reason, but I can add that. Oh, I see the chat. There you go. So maybe I can send this to you, and we can post this later. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start the actual presentation, and help me out here when you see the slides. Hopefully, it will display properly. Um, do you see the full display on your end, Andre?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you again for joining us. So this will be the formal part of the presentation, not the poetry part. So I want to build a little bit on what Professor Randy Ray presented a few minutes ago. So here we go. A quick kind of transition from the MMT concept to the job guarantee concept. MMT is about monetary sovereignty. A country that issues its own currency, collects taxes in the same national currency, issues bonds denominated only in its currency, and operates under a flexible exchange rate regime. What MMT highlights is the distinction between currency users and currency issuers, as Randy discussed earlier. So don't try this at home. This is for countries that have high degrees of monetary sovereignty. And when I say high degrees of monetary sovereignty, there's a spectrum of monetary sovereignty, meaning on one end of the spectrum, you have countries like Japan and the US and Canada and Australia and so on. These are countries that actually enjoy these benefits of not having any external debt, not having to fix their exchange rate to foreign currency or to gold or silver or Bitcoin or whatever, right? On the other extreme end of the spectrum, you have a country like Ecuador, for example, that literally doesn't have a national currency. It's a user of a foreign currency. But most countries, especially developing countries, are somewhere in the middle, somewhere in between, where they have a certain level of external debt that constrains their economic activity, and they have, for a variety of reasons, which we can discuss during the Q&A session, they have to at least partially fix their exchange rate to foreign currencies because they worry about inflation pass-through effects and so on. So I'm happy to come back to the case of developing countries. Here, I'm going to build on Randy's presentation on the case of the US in particular. So the question for MMTers and for economists becomes, how much can the government spend without hitting that inflation barrier? Well, the mainstream of the profession, they tell you, well, we're constrained by tax revenues and borrowing capacity. What MMT says is that there's this additional spending capacity, this bright yellow space that we're not tapping into. And that additional spending capacity, fiscal policy space, is not infinite. It's constrained, as you can see there, by the red bar. And what determines that ultimate limit is the risk of inflation. That's why MMTers always say, spend with an eye towards the risk of inflation. So you don't spend and wait for inflation to materialize, and then you say, uh-oh, what do we do now? You always spend and plan for where that inflation barrier might actually appear, in which pockets of the economy, in which industries. So the question becomes, what determines the risk of inflation? And the way I lay it out here is what determines the risk of inflation are two things. One is the lack of productive capacity, production bottlenecks, and so on. That is, if we run out of materials, skilled people, technology, and so on, and we decide to continue spending and increase demand, then sure, we'll have inflationary pressure. The second source of inflation has to do with abusive market power, with price-setting behaviors in key industries in the economy. Think of big pharma, think of oil and gas companies, think of telecom companies in many countries. These are companies that can raise prices and cause inflation and take advantage of additional spending that the government might be putting in place and cause inflation. Well, that kind of inflation risk, you're not going to get rid of it by spending less and imposing austerity. You only get rid of it by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence, by making those markets more competitive, democratizing the market, in other words. The problem here becomes a question of politics, of corruption, of transparency in the democratic system, because the elected officials who are in charge of antitrust laws and taxing and regulating abusive market power are brought to you by super PACs. Their campaigns are sponsored by big pharma and Wall Street and oil and gas companies. So that's why this becomes a question of democracy and power and influence and politics. So MMT highlights this and really brings a paradigm shift in terms of what the possibilities are. So if we're successful at building additional productive capacity, which creates millions of additional jobs, and if we're successful at democratizing the market, then we take that bright yellow space and actually stretch it out. We actually increase the potential spending capacity and push that inflation risk further and further out. So what does mainstream economics say about inflation? This is a Fed official 2 weeks after he retired from the Federal Reserve Board, that we have no reliable theory of inflation. In other words, we don't know what causes inflation. This is the ECB inflation forecast versus actual inflation. It's laughable in terms of what mainstream economists think will cause inflation, and therefore tell us we need to impose austerity on people versus what inflation actually is. Japan has been in a deflation cycle with negative interest rates for decades, literally now, even though it has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world, almost 260% of GDP at this point. So Japan is not Venezuela, Japan is not Zimbabwe. Again, going back to that spectrum of monetary sovereignty and the degrees of monetary sovereignty. So I'm going to skip this inflation slide. It's US specific, but I'm happy to go back to it. But it's essentially highlighting that there are 4 pockets that actually drive inflation in the US. And that's why when we talk about the Green New Deal, we highlight the importance of increasing productive capacity and taxing and regulating market power in these areas so that we actually tame the existing inflationary pressure and build these additional resources. Otherwise, we're excluding people, we're imposing unnecessary pain and inflationary pressure on the economy. I'm happy to go back to it. So ultimately, what MMT does is decouples the spending from taxing at the national level. So spend on national priorities, but then tax pollution to decarbonize, tax speculation to reduce instability, tax extreme wealth to reduce inequality, to reduce the power and influence of the oligarchs, but not because we need their money or their permission to spend on green jobs or anything else. Tax to protect democracy from oligarchy, reduce inequality, and so on. So these are the goals that MMT highlights from this analysis. Again, at the national level, not at the local, state, and municipal level, where your local municipality needs to tax in order to spend, needs to borrow in order to spend, and so on. So set the national priorities straight. For me, it's universal public services first. That is green infrastructure, healthcare, education, housing, childcare, you name it, whatever the national priorities are for a democratic society. The next layer is a job guarantee for people who want to work with living wages and benefits. And the third layer is a generous income support system, not a universal basic income, but a generous support system for people who cannot work, right? So these are the 3 layers. So today I'm going to focus on the job guarantee, why it's important and how it's structured. So you've probably heard Warren Mosler or Bill Mitchell use the dogs and bones metaphor. Since is this Easter or next week is Easter or something like that. So what we're experiencing here with unemployment is essentially a scenario where, imagine an Easter egg hunt. Here in the US, parents do this for kids at the park. They hide all these eggs all over the park with little chocolate and candy and little toys in them, and they send the kids out to hunt for them. So the parents are putting 90 eggs in the park, but we have 100 kids. So naturally, 10 kids will come back crying without any toy, without any candy. And essentially in the labor market, this is what we have. We have 90 jobs available, but we have 100 people looking for jobs. So what do we do with the 10 people who come back unemployed without jobs? We say you need training and education. We put you through, additional educational resources and so on. And then we repeat the experiment. And what we end up with, can you imagine if we take these 10 kids and say, well, you need additional training to find those Easter eggs at the park. And we put them through a boot camp and say, this is your fault. You need to work harder. You need to be more productive. You need to be more careful when you do the egg hunt, and repeat the experiment and send them out. right? Put them through that cruel experience, and then naturally those kids might perform better, but other kids will come back without eggs. So we're constantly doing this to people in the labor market where we're undersupplying jobs when we have structural problems that perpetually put a small group of people, a large group of people, I should say, millions of people, in a situation where they're excluded from the labor market. Well, the job guarantee guarantees that you add those 10 Easter eggs or those 10 jobs so that when you actually send people out to look for jobs, you have ample supply of decent employment opportunities with decent wages and benefits. So the private sector does what it does, but it doesn't supply enough jobs for workers. So it's the responsibility of the government to intervene and act as an employer of last resort, as Minsky called it, as others have called it. So the good news is that the job guarantee program in the US is the most popular jobs policy by far for Democrats, for Republicans, and so on. And this particular survey is really what sparked interest by Democrats in the last 4 years. So many of the presidential candidates in the last cycle all of a sudden put the job guarantee on their platform. Most of them didn't really understand it, but they thought it's popular, people like it, so we should have it. Again, survey after survey highlighting in every part of the country, the job guarantee is the most popular employment program. And this is not new. The idea that the government should act as an employer of last resort. William Petty in the 1600s wrote about this in a kind of different context, obviously. He said the unemployed ought neither to be starved nor hanged nor given away. Such a cruel system. The unemployed are an untapped source of enrichment for the nation, and they could be publicly employed to build infrastructure. Kind of the earlier things. David Ricardo, in the Transition into Capitalism, in the third edition of his Principles of Political Economy of Taxation, right before he died, essentially, he added one more chapter in that third edition on machinery. And he said, the substitution of machinery for human labor is often very injurious to the interest of the class of laborers. The same cause which may increase the net revenue of a country may at the same time render the population redundant and deteriorate the condition of labor. So this is where we started to see large-scale unemployment in the transition to capitalism, essentially the Industrial Revolution. And of course, Marx shows up after Ricardo and talks about the reserve army of the unemployed and so on. So the job guarantee literature is saying there's massive potential employment opportunities that we can bring in. The Great Depression was obviously case in point, mass unemployment. The New Deal programs were an earlier example of what a job guarantee can do, where the government can marshal resources to build infrastructure for agricultural capacity, electrification in rural areas. Today, we'll talk about broadbandification in rural areas, reintroducing the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which at the time planted more than 2 billion trees, built the national parks. Today will help us decarbonize the system and so on. So unemployment dropped because of the New Deal policies, but Roosevelt was concerned about the deficit, so he cut many of the programs, and immediately the unemployment rate jumped back up after he canceled quite a few of those programs. So the Fed was not doing the right thing. They doubled reserve requirements. They were worried about the inflation or hyperinflation. Unemployment went back up to 19%. And it wasn't really until World War II hit where the massive absorption of the labor force came in with the war effort. How did we control inflation? The concern was at the time, Keynes wrote about this, and Randy Ray and Yeva also wrote about this recently. The concern wasn't about the spending. The concern was about finding the productive capacity and managing inflation that is driven by shortage of productive capacity. So we essentially came the closest to full employment in 1942 when the U.S. entered the war with that absorption. So Minsky shows up in the 1960s, early 1960s, in the context of the war on poverty, and starts to write about a jobs program that will address structural inequality and poverty and will be the buffer stock employment mechanism. So when President Johnson declared the war on poverty, Minsky was critical of it, and he wrote a couple of pieces on this because it was meant to um, not address the root causes of poverty, but to fix the poor as opposed to fixing poverty. So these are three pieces that Minsky wrote on this subject in the context of the war on poverty. So the job guarantee in three basic bullet points. Minsky says, take workers as they are, where they are. In other words, don't tell them, go get the training and then come back. Learn how to code, move to San Francisco, and then maybe you'll find the jobs. Take workers as they are, where they are, and do on-the-job paid training. In other words, jobs first, training later. You do the training on the job. Which is essentially what we don't do currently in the labor market. We tell people, go get the education, pay for it out of pocket, move to San Francisco. That's where the coding jobs are. That's where the future is. And we end up excluding so many people from the labor market because of these barriers. Minsky says, take people as they are and do on-the-job paid training. So think of a job guarantee in a country like the US, for example, or any other country, as an exercise where you're matching in a democratic system, you're matching the needs of the local community. So you have a participatory democracy system, participatory planning, participatory budgeting, participatory auditing, where the community decides these are the needs of the community that the private sector and the mainline government sector is not providing currently, or is undersupplying, or is supplying them at an exclusive price that excludes many people from those services. So set those priorities straight, rank them by priority, and then match those jobs with the existing pool of unemployed workers in the community. And if those workers have the skills needed to match the needs of the community, then the national authority, the federal government, will fund it in the way we talked about MMT. But if the skills don't match the needs of the community, then you do on-the-job paid training and you build capacity locally. And that's how you build resilience in every community without destroying the social fabric and forcing people to move and excluding people from employment opportunities. So the government will offer to hire anyone who's ready, willing, and able to work at a socially established living wage. Could be the minimum wage, could be minimum wage with benefits. It depends on what society decides to do this. Obviously, I would like it to be a living wage with full benefits and so on. So this is not a make work program. You're not forcing people to work. You're offering the job and saying, who is looking for work? Who's ready, willing, and able to work? The job guarantee is decentralized, as I said. The projects are selected based on community needs and implemented by NGOs and local government authorities with all the transparency needed and democratic principles implemented. Only the financing comes from the national authority, but the selection and implementation and the management of the projects will be done at the local level. The private sector employers can now obtain labor at a markup over the job guarantee fixed wage. In other words, if we create a job guarantee program, some people will be working in the private sector, some people will be working in the job guarantee sector, and there will be no unemployed individual because anybody who's ready, willing, and able to work will be able to find employment. What if the private sector now wants to expand its economic activity? There will be no unemployed individuals left because the rest are in the job guarantee pool. Well, now the private sector can recruit individuals who are already employed in the job guarantee sector. But in order to attract them, you have to offer them at least the same wage benefits package, if not more, in order to attract them. And that also incentivizes the private sector to continue to automate. In other words, if we're talking about robotics and artificial intelligence, a lot of people see it as a danger to employment and labor unions and so on. I say, if the robots are coming, we should celebrate. Let them do the repetitive work, the painful work, the dangerous work, the precarious work, and let people do the more dignified work and pay them decent wages and benefits to do it. And the care economy, caring for people, caring for the children, for the elderly, for the planet. So I don't see automation and increased productivity in the private sector as a threat. As a matter of fact, it needs to be celebrated as long as we have all the checks and balances and criteria in place. So in other words, the job guarantee adds the stabilization feature because it pays a fixed wage and sets a floor for the entire economy. The job guarantee reduces depreciation of skills caused by unemployment, especially long-term unemployment. And we know this from surveys by employers who say, our preference is to hire somebody who's already working for a competitor, ideally, right? Because they're ready to go, they have the skills and experience and so on. Second choice will be somebody who just graduated college or somebody who just lost their job recently. But somebody who's been unemployed long-term, they're not up to speed, their skills depreciate and so on. So there's an additional benefit of the job guarantee that it produces a pool of employable people who are ready to transition into the private sector. The job guarantee contains, as I said, training components to prepare you for that transition into the private sector. And on the macro effect, the job guarantee reduces the uncertainty related to business cycles because you're essentially underwriting and guaranteeing that those who would be otherwise unemployed are guaranteed employment, are guaranteed to have basic skills to re-enter the economy, but they're also guaranteed having a stable income so that their consumption pattern continues without uncertainty. So if you're in the private sector, that helps in taking and making investment decisions, especially large-scale industrial manufacturing decisions, which are risky, which are uncertain based on what might happen in the business cycle. So that helps smooth the business cycle, but it will not guarantee that the business cycle will be flat. Will be recessions will be completely eliminated, but at least it provides that underwriting of potential consumption. So the job guarantee does not displace private sector jobs. It complements private sector jobs because we're adding jobs in areas that are undersupplied by the private sector. Examples: low-income housing restoration, expansion of public parks, improvement of public infrastructure, recycling jobs, environmental cleanup, Green New Deal decarbonization jobs, and all kinds of jobs related to the care economy. And this benefits primarily the most neglected areas of the country, the most neglected vulnerable communities that the private sector is not willing to serve, that in many cases the government sector, due to austerity, has actually cut social programs and undermined the needs of the community. So plenty of examples. I'm happy to go back to this. And Minsky used to talk about 57 varieties of capitalism. So I jokingly say 57 varieties of job guarantee. We had the New Deal in the US, we have the Swedish corporatist model, we have Plan Jefes they have got in Argentina during their crisis in 2000, 2001. Which was the head of household employment program, India's NREGA program, National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which is the largest in the world today. We have all of these examples, and many, many other countries have, public works programs. None of those is actually the job guarantee program that I described here, that Minsky and Randy Ray and others describe, because these tend to be temporary, introduced during a crisis. They typically are limited in terms of who qualifies for how many hours, and the pay usually doesn't include the benefits and doesn't include everything else we're talking about. So yes, they're good examples to show that there's plenty of room for public works programs, for environmental programs, and so on. But these programs need to be permanent as opposed to temporary to crisis. Because in order to create that buffer stock effect, which I'll describe in a minute, you have to have a permanent intervention. So I'll give you an example. Buffer stock programs are typically used in commodity markets by governments. So the federal government in the US and many other governments around the world do the same. If the price of corn drops close to zero because there is mass production of corn, the government intervenes as a buyer of last resort of corn or wheat or whatever commodity in order to reduce. Can you wait for a minute, please? The government intervenes as a buyer of last resort in order to set a floor under the price of corn. And what do we do with that corn? It's stored in massive warehouses, and some of it is given away to countries that experience natural disasters and so on. But if the if in 2 or 3 years the government is experiencing a situation where the price of corn is skyrocketing because there's a crop failure, there's been floods or forest fires or whatever, and it's going to hurt consumers with price inflation, then the government steps in as a seller of last resort and sells that surplus. So it creates a buffer for the price of corn to stabilize it over time. So here we're saying the most important commodity. Can you take your brother outside, please? The most important commodity is not corn or wheat. We have price stabilization features for those, but the most important commodity or the most important thing we have in the economy is labor. We don't have a buyer of last resort for labor. Can you take your brother? Come grab him by the hand, please. Yeah. Sorry about that. So that's really what the buffer stock mechanism for labor would be. It will be an intervention by the government, not to store labor in warehouses like we do for in prisons or like we do with corn and wheat, but to use the surplus labor during that cycle in order to decarbonize the economy, serve the most vulnerable communities, and transition people back into the labor market. So to conclude, the unemployment, poverty, inequality situation calls for urgent and bold actions. The current jobs policies are too weak, too slow, too expensive, and ineffective. They don't even work. So guaranteed employment at a living wage is possible, desirable, and affordable. So with that, I'm happy to take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, quite a lot of questions popped up. Yeah, just to kind of try to summarize my understanding. This would kind of mean also reframing of the government function to kind of more like, platform access to labor rather than like saying, this is what is needed, you put it to the communities to kind of participatory decide what is needed.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Very nice. Okay, so we have a lot of questions popping up here. I'll start from the top for the ones who receive the most. And the first question is from Sophie. Is the NAIRU a fictional and something used to justify unemployment?
NAIRU, yeah.
NAIRU.
The natural rate of unemployment, other words that mainstream economists use. Well, NAIRU assumes that there is, if unemployment drops below a certain level, below a certain natural level, whatever that is, right? And empirically, they can't really tell you what that level is because it changes all the time, right? But the idea is that if it drops below a certain level, inflation will start to accelerate. And I addressed a little bit the concern about inflation, right? The last 12 years since the 2008 financial crisis, everybody's saying the quantitative easing, all these government deficits, Japan's case since the 1990s, these massive deficits in national debt are going to cause inflation or hyperinflation. In some cases, they said it's going to cause interest rate to skyrocket. It's going to bankrupt countries and governments like Japan will start defaulting and all of that. None of it has been true, right? MMT has been able to provide a more rigorous explanation of why Japan, for example, has had deflation rather than inflation, why Japan has negative interest rates as opposed to high interest rates, why a country like Japan can't default, why a country like the US can't default. So the MMT approach to inflation, which rejects this automatic trade-off between unemployment and inflation at the natural rate of unemployment, shows that we have that additional spending capacity, as I showed earlier, that we can tap into to create additional jobs, to decarbonize the economy without risking to hit that inflation barrier. Now, if you're a developing country and you have limited productive capacity and you have massive external debt, then your fiscal policy space is much more limited, right? So it doesn't mean that developing countries can't introduce a job guarantee, but you have to be extremely strategic in terms of how you introduce a job guarantee. So that limited spending capacity in a developing country in most developing countries has to do with the lack of food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and weak industrial structure that forces them into producing low value added manufacturing goods, so assembly line types of jobs. So, in order to increase your fiscal policy space as a small developing nation, you have to build more resilience in those areas. So you have to prioritize food sovereignty. You have to prioritize energy sovereignty, ideally renewable energy sovereignty, in order at least to secure a functioning economy that doesn't have to rely on food prices being determined abroad or energy prices being determined abroad. So you can't run an economy without food and energy. These are the basis. So developing countries need to prioritize those needs. And then you start building additional productive capacity and try to climb up the ladder of the value added chain so that you're not the cheap assembly line, manufacturing base for the global north, so that you're gradually over time, by investing in education, technical training, vocational training, and research and development, you start acquiring greater productive capacity to specialize in more complex production systems. So that's kind of the short answer.
Yeah. Thank you. That was
The
really,
mainstream doesn't have any of these nuances built in. There's just this assumption that too much money is automatically going to cause inflation.
so it's lacking rigor to its analysis is also what you're saying. Yeah. Okay, there's another question here. Are there job guarantee proposals about building a care economy?
Absolutely. If I forgot to mention in this presentation a great book by my colleague Pavlina Cherneva, The Case for the Job Guarantee, which was published almost a year ago, a few months ago. Her work is available on the Levy Economics Institute website. She's written extensively on the care economy. And I mentioned it earlier, caring for people, caring for the planet, caring for the elderly. These are the kinds of jobs that will not be displaced by robotics or artificial intelligence. You can still use robotics and artificial intelligence and technical innovation to supplement, the work that we do in the care economy, but it's never going to fully replace caring for people. So absolutely, yeah. Others have written about it too, Randy and Stephanie Kelton and Matt Forstater.
Thanks. Good answer. Um, Another one here is also from Sophie. How do business people react to the job guarantee as it will prevent wages falling below the living wage and stop companies paying below that wage, but would also lead to more trained workers? Some
Yeah,
implications there.
yeah. So you're right. So there's a couple of nuances here about the business people and how business reacts to this. Yes, there's an advantage that you have a pool of employable workers with higher levels of skills and experience and so on. So that's an advantage, and it enhances productivity and so on. Um, there's also this idea that the unemployed are used as a threat against unions or against workers because you're a disposable worker. You can be replaced immediately by somebody who's unemployed, who's willing to take your job with lower benefits and lower wages, which is an empty threat in reality, because we know the long-term unemployed are not even close to being substituted. And we know this from surveys from employers who say they're actually not a substitute. They cost us a lot of money to train on the jobs. We're not even willing to hire them. That's why I mentioned earlier the surveys that say the first choice is somebody who's working for a competitor. The second choice is somebody who's not in the industry but working somewhere else, which means in the labor market already, or short-term unemployed but not long-term unemployed. Those are structural. There are lots of structural issues. So there's that additional nuance. The third one that I want to highlight here in terms of what a democratic society aspires to establish as a minimum standard. I'll take you back to the days of transition away from slavery in the United States. What did the slave owners say about raising the wage, about actually making it illegal to enslave people and not pay them for their work and to abuse their life workplace conditions and so on? Well, what did society say? We said if this does, because they said that we'll be out of business if we have to pay people wages. Well, society said, well, you should be out of business if you can't compete and if you can't pay people decent wages, and somebody else will take your spot and will become more productive and will invest in productivity and technology and innovation and will make it work. And that's how we transition. So today in the US in particular, we haven't raised the minimum wage in ages, and people are still complaining we're not going to be able to afford it, right? So an additional nuance to this, because there's a big difference in the US between big business and small business, especially in rural areas, small business. So yes, a higher minimum wage for a company like Amazon or Walmart, they can afford it. Because what will those workers do with the additional wages they receive? They're going to turn around and buy more stuff from Walmart. So we know it works for them, right? But how about small businesses, small restaurant owners, family owned businesses, and so on? The biggest burden they face today, before we even decide to raise the minimum wage, is the cost of healthcare in the US, is
Right.
what we call the FICA tax, which is almost 14% split half and half between the employer and the employee. That's like punishing people for working, punishing employers for hiring workers. So you can eliminate that for small businesses at least. You don't have to eliminate it for
Yeah.
large businesses, and that will more than offset the cost of so that just that tax, the cost of additional wages. The other major
Yeah.
source is the cost of healthcare. As an employer, if you hire a full-time employee, you have to pay for their healthcare,
Yeah.
and it's a
Sure.
massive burden. So that's why we talk about Medicare for all, so that the burden is not on the employer and the employees. So that
Yeah.
more than offsets the fact that we are going to raise wages even for small businesses. So the job guarantee is not a silver bullet that's going to solve all of these additional problems, but it
Yeah.
highlights what other nuances need to be addressed. And that's why in the MMT community and the Green New Deal community, we have this full package of
Yeah.
resetting the standards once and for all. And we've done it before. We've done it when we transitioned from slavery. We've done it when we introduced the New Deal in the 30s. We know how to finance things without causing inflation, like the case of World War II, like the CARES Act, right? We didn't tax anybody. We didn't borrow from anybody. The country is not bankrupt. So we're highlighting all of these facts and we're
Mm.
saying, let's do this whole thing at once, the right way, to save our lives, literally.
I like that. Um, that we are running dry on this session, like it's 2 minutes left, but there's some practical questions about the job guarantee, which I thought just to like raise.
Yep.
And I can just do them in the bulk, and you can kind of answer to them how you want. So, one of
And
them is
there's going to be the cafe session afterwards. I'm happy to take some of those questions later there
exactly.
in the cafe.
Okay, yeah, because yeah, there's things like different tiers of pay. How would that be? Would it just be the minimum wage? And then there's also something on like, would it just be reducing universal basic income to a 40-week presence duty? Would it possible to be like fired from a jobs guarantee job? Uh,
Sure.
and then also, should the government establish regulations to limit the replacement of labor by technology in the economy? So kind of big questions. We can kind
Sure.
of we can kind of transition with them to the cafe session, but if you want
Yeah,
to have like an ending statement, you can do that now.
happy to do that. And these will take more than 30 seconds to talk about. So I'll address the questions about UBI, about technology and regulating, replacing workers with technology. Some people talk about taxing robots, right, to fund, basic income and things like that. I'm happy to discuss those. I'm familiar with those topics.
Fully automated luxury and so forth. Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you for a great session.